They didn't die screaming. They didn't bleed. They didn't fight. 10 men entered the Amazon in 1923, and one by one, their lives simply stopped after something watched them breathe. No legend begins like that. No official report ends like that either. What you're about to hear survived only because someone was desperate enough to write it down. This is not a myth passed by word of mouth. This is not a campfire story shaped by time. These are letters, written by a man who believed reason would protect him, until reason was no longer enough. The last safe day. Deep in the Amazon basin, far beyond mapped rivers and trading posts, there was a place known only to the rubber companies as Camp Verde. No roads, no towns, just river, jungle, and contracts, signed in distant cities by men who would never smell what waited there. In August of 1923, a 10-man rubber collection crew arrived after weeks on the river. They were professionals, not explorers chasing glory, not missionaries chasing souls, workers chasing a future. Their leader was Antonio Roshia, educated, methodical, and deeply practical. A man who wrote letters every chance he got, not because he was sentimental, but because writing anchored him to the world beyond the trees. The jungle greeted them politely at first. Birds screamed overhead. Insects filled the air like static. The forest breathed, loud, alive, endless. Antonio wrote that first night by lantern light, describing the camp as modest but efficient. Canvas shelters, a cooking fire, a supply shed cleared from ancient undergrowth that looked untouched for centuries. Nothing felt wrong yet, and that's important, because whatever was watching them didn't rush. Men who believed they were alone. The crew fell into routine quickly. Dawn work, midday rest, evening processing of latex into smoking, huts that burned the eyes and stained the lungs. They laughed. They sang. They argued about food and home. Antonio mentioned the men by name in his letters, not as characters, but as proof that this was real. Miguel Santos, the guide, 30 years in the jungle, a man who knew when birds lied and when silence told the truth. João Alvarez, young and eager, always volunteering, still believing hard work could control fate. Others, capable, ordinary human. This matters because nothing supernatural begins with fear. It begins with normalcy, and then something changes. The first omission. About 2 weeks in, Antonio noticed something subtle enough that he almost didn't write it down. The jungle was quieter, not silent, just reduced. Bird calls thinning, insects fewer at dusk, mosquitoes once unbearable, nearly gone. The men joked about it, called it luck, said the smoke must be driving pests away. But Miguel didn't joke. When Antonio mentioned the quiet, Miguel didn't explain. He didn't reassure. He said only this: sometimes the forest holds its breath. No laughter followed. No elaboration came later. And when a man with 30 years of survival knowledge refuses to explain, that refusal is the explanation. Tracks that didn't wander. A few days later, Antonio found footprints near the supply shed. Large, deep, too deep. Miguel identified them as tapir tracks, but he hesitated. Just a fraction too long. Antonio noticed something else. The spacing. Animals wander. They drift. They adjust. These tracks didn't. They were placed evenly, carefully, as if whatever made them was thinking about where to step. Antonio wrote that detail down, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. That tells you how badly he wanted to stay rational. The story Miguel didn't want to tell. One night by firelight, the men pressed Miguel for stories. Jungle legends, local myths, something to break the monotony. Miguel resisted until drink loosened his tongue. Then he spoke a name he clearly hadn't planned to say out loud. Mapinguari, not shouted, not dramatized, spoken quietly, like saying it too loudly might draw attention. Miguel described something upright, massive, protected by hide no blade could cut. But what ended the laughter wasn't the size. It was the face, one eye, single, centered, and a mouth that opened backward into the body. When Miguel said this, the fire popped. No one laughed, because fear doesn't come from details alone. It comes from the way someone remembers them. Miguel ended the story with a sentence that didn't sound like folklore at all. The smell comes first. Rot. Metal. Blood left too long in heat. A smell that doesn't drift, because it moves with intention. The night the forest listened. Antonio didn't believe in monsters. He believed in exhaustion, in isolation, in imagination. That belief lasted until the night he woke to absolute silence. No insects, no birds, no movement, nothing. Just his own heartbeat, loud enough to feel invasive. 10 minutes passed. Then the forest slowly returned to life, as if something had finished listening. Miguel didn't dismiss it. He nodded once and said, "The forest has its reasons." That was the night Antonio stopped crossing things out of his letters. because deep down he knew something had already begun, and whatever it was, had not been disturbed by their presence. It had been alerted. Cliffhanger ending. Antonio ends this part of his final peaceful letter with a question he never answers. If the jungle could hold its breath, what happens when it exhales? The forest didn't attack them. It adjusted to them, and that difference would cost the first man his life. Antonio wrote less confidently after the silence incident. Not frightened yet, but alert in the way a man becomes when patterns stop making sense. Days passed. Work continued. Rubber flowed. On paper, Camp Verde was thriving. But the jungle was no longer behaving like a place where humans belonged. The vanishing life. By mid-September, the change was impossible to ignore. Game disappeared first. No deer near the river. No capybara trails. No peccary herds crashing through brush. Hunting trips returned empty-handed. Fishing nets came back light. Even the fish, creatures with nowhere else to go, were fewer. Antonio noted something disturbing. Predators usually follow prey. But there were no jaguar calls. No signs of competition. It wasn't migration, it was avoidance, as if the jungle itself had decided where life was allowed to exist, and where it wasn't. The smell arrives. It came at dusk, not suddenly, not carried by wind. It appeared, a heavy stench of rotting meat mixed with iron, sharp enough to coat the tongue. The men checked supplies, checked traps, checked each other. Nothing explained it. Then the smell moved, slowly, methodically, circling the camp, always the same distance away. Antonio wrote that detail twice. Not drifting, not spreading, tracking. Miguel ordered the fires built higher that night. Not for warmth, not for animals, for something that didn't fear flame, but respected boundaries. Breathing that didn't belong. The men stayed awake, rifles loaded, machetes in hand. No one spoke above a whisper. That's when Antonio heard it. Breathing! Not the fast panic of an animal, not the irregular rasp of lungs struggling. This was controlled. Inhale. Pause, exhale, pause, slow enough to be deliberate, measured like someone counting seconds. Animals don't breathe like that. Men do. But no man was standing beyond the firelight. Miguel stopped Juan from raising his rifle. He shook his head once. Don't challenge it. Because whatever was breathing wasn't approaching. It was learning. The circle. By morning, the smell was gone. No attack, no damage. Relief tried to settle in. Then they saw the vegetation, all around the camp, flattened outward in a near-perfect circle, not broken, not torn, pressed down, and released, as if something massive had stood in multiple places, always facing inward. Watching, Antonio realized something then. This wasn't a predator. Predators strike. This was something else, an intelligence-establishing presence. The first death. Watches were organized. Pairs at first. Then singles, confidence creeping back in. Carlos Mendez took the midnight watch. At dawn, they found him seated against a tree, rifle across his lap, safety still on, eyes open. No wounds, no marks, no signs of struggle. He looked like a man who had simply decided to stop living. Miguel examined him longer than anyone else. He said a word in an indigenous language Antonio didn't recognize. When pressed, Miguel answered quietly. He looked at something that was not meant to be seen. Carlos was buried that afternoon. The jungle was silent during the burial. No birds, no insects, as if the forest was listening again. Bullets mean nothing. That night, the smell returned stronger. Closer. The breathing came from multiple directions. Jam fired 3 shots into the darkness. They heard impacts. Solid. Heavy. Like bullets striking wood nor stone. No cry. No movement. The breathing paused. Then resumed, unchanged. Miguel forbade further gunfire. Bullets, he said, only proved fear. And fear was already understood. That sentence terrified Antonio more than the smell, because it implied intention. The guide who ran. The supply boat didn't arrive. Then Miguel disappeared. No announcement. No farewell. Just a note. Scouting downriver. He took no rifle. No food. Only his machete. Antonio understood immediately. A man doesn't forget survival basics after 30 years. Miguel didn't forget. He fled, and if the man who knew the jungle better than anyone chose the river over the camp, then the camp was already dead. Blessings that failed. Father Sebastian tried to reclaim control. He walked the camp perimeter, reciting prayers, sprinkling blessed water. The moment the circle closed, the breathing began. Not one source, many, perfectly synchronized. Sebastian dropped the book and ran. He would not speak afterward, only mouthed prayers silently, eyes fixed on the trees. Men who chose the river. 3 men left at dawn. They took a canoe, said they'd rather face currents than stay another night. Their screams came around midnight. The canoe returned at dawn, empty. undamaged. Antonio stopped counting hope that morning. They were down to 6. The camp no longer felt temporary. It felt claimed, and whatever claimed it was patient. Terribly patient. The glimpse. Lightning revealed it, just once. A flash between thunderclaps. A single massive eye, yellow-green and reflective, unblinking. Below it, a vertical opening that wasn't a mouth so much as a depth. A space. When the light vanished, so did the shape. But Antonio knew, because fear fades. Recognition does not. Cliffhanger ending. Antonio ends part 2 with a sentence written shakily, darker than anything before it. This thing is not killing us. It is teaching us. Predators hunt to eat. This thing hunted to teach. And the next lesson would prove that escape itself was an illusion. After Miguel vanished, time stopped behaving normally. Days blurred. Nights stretched impossibly long. Antonio wrote that sleep no longer refreshed. It only reset the fear. Every waking moment felt borrowed. They abandoned the rubber work completely. The trees stood untapped, bleeding nothing. The smoking hut went cold. Camp Verde was no longer a workplace. It was a waiting room. Presence becomes routine. The smell no longer announced itself dramatically. It was just there, at dawn, at noon, at night, clinging to clothes, settling into hair, coating food until everything tasted like rust and decay. Antonio realized something horrifying. You can't stay afraid forever. Fear burns energy. What replaced it was worse. Adaptation. They learned where to sit, where not to look, how to keep the fire high enough to feel protected, but never safe. The breathing became familiar. That slow, patient rhythm marking time better than any clock. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. Antonio began to catch himself breathing in sync with it, and had to consciously stop. The thing steps closer. One afternoon in full daylight it broke a rule. It appeared. Not fully. Not enough. Just enough to remove doubt. A massive shape stood at the tree line, no, more than 3 meters from the nearest tent. They all saw it. The bulk, the impossible width, the hide-like layered bark. Renato raised his rifle and fired 6 shots. Center mass. Every bullet struck. They saw the impacts. The thing didn't flinch, didn't roar, didn't retaliate. It simply stood there, allowing the shots to happen. Then it turned and walked away. Not fast, not retreating. Choosing. Antonio understood the message instantly. Weapons were irrelevant. Resistance was permitted only to prove futility. What it leaves behind. That night, Father Sebastian tried to kill himself. Thomas stopped him, wrestled the knife away. Sebastian kept repeating the same sentence over and over. It wants us alive. It wants us to see. No one asked what he meant. They already knew. Paulo hunks. Fear finally broke someone. Paulo ran at noon, full sunlight, screaming. Antonio and João chased him until their lungs burned. Then the jungle swallowed the sound. They searched for hours, found nothing. No blood, no body, just one boot, standing upright on the trail, as if Paulo had stepped out of it and continued without needing feet. They didn't retrieve it. Some things are warnings, not evidence. The lesson of the river. Renato decided the jungle wasn't the real trap. The river was still open, still moving, still promising distance. He waited until night, pushed the canoe off silently. Antonio woke to the sound of paddling and ran to the bank with the others. They shouted for Renato to return. He didn't look back. That's when the smell intensified until breathing hurt. The thing emerged fully, not a glimpse, not a fragment. All of it. 4 meters tall, broader than any animal, covered entirely in that bark-like hide. The single eye fixed on the river. The backward mouth opened slightly, not wide, not threatening. Curious, it walked into the water. The current reached its waist. It didn't slow it. Renato saw it coming. They heard his screams echo downriver. The thing reached him in seconds. It didn't attack. It lifted the canoe out of the water. Renato still inside and raised it to eye level. The screaming stopped instantly. Silence replaced it. The thing set the canoe back down, turned, and walked back to shore. The canoe drifted back an hour later. Renato sat upright, paddle across his knees, eyes open, dead. No marks, no struggle, just absence. The river was no escape. Marked. After that night, something changed. The thing came closer, inside the camp. Antonio woke to find it standing beside his cot, lit by dying firelight. The eye looked down at him, not hungry, not angry. Patient. The mouth opened. Antonio saw depth inside it, space that didn't belong in a body. He felt a massive hand touch his chest. No pressure, no pain. Cold spread outward from the contact, as if something inside him was being measured. Then it withdrew, moved to João's tent. Another touch, another mark. The thing didn't kill them. It selected them, understanding too late. João never woke properly after that. He sat by the fire breathing shallowly, wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak. On the third day his heart stopped. Antonio buried him alone. 6 graves now, crosses made from tent poles. Antonio wrote that he was no longer afraid of dying. He was afraid of knowing, because the thing didn't want fear, it wanted comprehension. And Antonio realized the final lesson was coming, not in darkness, not in violence, but in truth. Cliffhanger ending. Antonio's final line in this section is almost illegible, written as if his hand no longer fully obeyed him. It is close now, and I think it wants me to understand what it is before it decides what I am. The jungle didn't hide it anymore. It didn't need to. By the time Antonio understood the truth, there was no one left to warn. Antonio stopped counting days. Dates still appeared at the top of his letters, but they felt ceremonial, like prayers repeated out of habit rather than belief. Time at Camp Verde had warped into something circular. Nights bled into mornings. Mornings dissolved into dread. He was alone now, completely. 6 graves marked the clearing. 6 crosses leaning slightly inward, as if even the dead were listening. The jungle had reclaimed everything else. When silence becomes company. The smell never left. Antonio wrote that it had stopped being something he noticed. It was simply part of breathing now, like humidity, like heat. The human body adapts even to poison if exposure is slow enough. The breathing continued every night, sometimes close, sometimes distant, sometimes directly behind his tent, always patient. Antonio realized something unsettling. The breathing wasn't for him. It was for itself, a rhythm, a discipline, a reminder that it existed long before he did, and would exist long after. The thing finally speaks, not with words, with presence. One night the fire burned low. Antonio hadn't fed it on purpose. He wanted to see what would happen if he stopped pretending control still existed. The jungle responded immediately. The thing stepped into the camp, fully. No trees obscured it this time. No shadows hid proportions. Antonio described it with the precision of a man who knew memory was all he had left. 4 meters tall, wider than any bull, limbs too long, joints bending with careful restraint, hide layered like ancient bark, scarred, scarless, immune. The single eye dominated its face, not glowing, reflecting. The backward mouth opened slightly, and Antonio understood. It wasn't a mouth. It was a passage. What lives inside? Antonio felt compelled, not forced to look. That terrified him more than any violence could have. Inside the opening was depth that made no physical sense, a space larger than the body that contained it. Darkness layered over darkness, and movement, not writhing, not chaotic, organized, as if the thing carried an interior forest older than the one surrounding them. Antonio saw shapes that weren't separate from the darkness, but part of it. Echoes, reflections, presences that did not have edges. He realized then why the others had died the way they did. They hadn't been attacked. They had been exposed. The human mind was not designed to process what lived inside that depth. Some hearts stopped immediately. Others lingered, emptied. Something pressed gently against his chest again. That cold spread, but this time it stayed longer. The truth Miguel knew. In a sudden, crushing moment of clarity, Antonio understood why Miguel had fled. Not because he feared death, because he knew what the thing was. Miguel had lived long enough in the jungle to learn the oldest rule. Some guardians do not protect life. They protect balance. The Mapinguari was not a monster. It was a boundary, a living warning etched into flesh and fear. Camp Verde wasn't attacked because it was weak. It was targeted because it was successful, because humans had stayed too long, taken too much, gone too deep. The thing didn't kill intruders immediately. It made them understand why they should never have come, why escape was never allowed. Antonio wrote that night until his hands cramped. He realized the river had been left open on purpose. So they would try it, so they would learn. The forest paths remained visible, so panic would choose them. Every option existed except survival, because the lesson wasn't confinement. It was inevitability. Once seen, you belonged to the place that showed itself to you. The final understanding. Antonio no longer begged. He no longer prayed. He addressed the thing directly, not aloud, but in his thoughts. What are you? The eye focused on him, and for the first time Antonio felt something pass between them, not language, recognition. The Mapinguari was old beyond time, born when forests were uninterrupted, when humans were still stories told by firelight. It did not hate, it did not hunt, it corrected. And now Antonio understood the final truth. It wasn't waiting to kill him. It was waiting for him to finish understanding. The last letter begins. Antonio wrote one final letter to Elena, not frantic, not terrified, clear. He told her he loved her, that Maria was his light, that some places on Earth were not meant to be known, only respected. He apologized for believing reason was armor. As dawn approached, the breathing moved closer, right outside the tent. Antonio did not raise the fire. He did not reach for his rifle. He folded the letters carefully, placed them in the supply chest, sealed it, and waited, because now he knew. Cliffhanger ending. Antonio ends this part with a sentence, written calmly, more calmly than anything before it. It is here again, and this time, it is not watching. The moment it stopped watching was the moment Antonio realized death was no longer the goal. Dawn came without color. Antonio wrote that the sun rose like a rumor, present but unwilling to commit. Light filtered through the canopy in weak, pale shafts that did nothing to warm the camp or soften the smell. The breathing was still there, closer than it had ever been. Not outside the perimeter, not at the trees, inside the camp. Antonio could hear it without lifting his head from the ground. Each inhale pressed against his ears, slow and heavy as if the air itself had weight now. The pauses between breaths stretched long enough to make him wonder if it had stopped, until the next inhale arrived with absolute certainty. It wasn't hiding anymore. It had no reason to. When fear breaks permanently, Antonio noticed something alarming about himself. He wasn't panicking. His hands still shook, but his thoughts were clear, focused, calm in the way people become when their mind finally accepts a truth the body has resisted for too long. Fear had exhausted itself. What replaced it was submission to reality, not surrender, acceptance. He understood now that the others hadn't died because they were weak. They died because their minds fractured under understanding. And Antonio hadn't fractured yet. The thing moves differently now. The Mapinguari circled the camp in daylight, not stalking, not threatening, demonstrating. Antonio forced himself to watch. It moved with deliberate care, placing each step as if the jungle floor were fragile. Vines bent and rose again. Leaves were pressed, not torn. Even its mass obeyed rules. This was not a creature fighting the forest. It was part of its structure. Antonio realized the hide wasn't armor. It was age. Layer upon layer of time hardened into flesh. The eye passed over the graves, paused, then moved on, as if acknowledging completion. The question Antonio didn't want answered. Antonio finally spoke out loud. His voice cracked from disuse. "Why us?" The sound felt wrong in the air, too small, too human. The Mapinguari stopped. The eye turned, and Antonio felt pressure, not in his ears but behind his eyes. A sensation like memory being stirred. Images rose uninvited. Forests without camps, rivers without canoes, trees untouched, older than recorded history. Then men arriving, cutting, burning, taking, not just Camp Verde. Others, hundreds of small wounds across centuries. Antonio understood. The Mapinguari was not responding to a single camp. Camp Verde was simply the one that stayed too long. Why some were taken quickly. Antonio remembered Carlos, dead but untouched. He remembered Renato, returned intact. And João left breathing but empty. The difference wasn't chance. It was exposure time. Those who saw too much too fast broke instantly. Those who were allowed to adapt lasted longer. Antonio had been writing the entire time, processing, anchoring himself through language. Words had slowed the damage. Writing hadn't saved him. It had delayed the lesson. The camp at midday. At noon, the Mapinguari entered the center of Camp Verde. It stood where the fire pit had once burned hottest. Antonio was less than 2 meters away. He could see details now. The hide was not uniform. Ridges like growth rings in trees marked its surface. Some older, some newer. Evidence that time left marks even on guardians. The backward mouth opened fully. Antonio saw inside again. But this time something was different. He didn't recoil. The darkness didn't rush him. It waited. And for the first time, Antonio understood the final stage. This wasn't death. It was transfer. The last choice that wasn't a choice. Antonio felt the cold touch again, this time not on his chest, but at the base of his skull. Memories surged. Elena's face, Maria learning to walk, the smell of bread in their kitchen. He realized with quiet horror that these memories weren't being taken. They were being measured, catalogued. The Mapinguari wasn't feeding. It was recording. Antonio understood then why it needed witnesses. Why it let men live long enough to understand. The forest didn't just erase intruders. It learned from them, so it could recognize the next ones faster. Better. Antonio's final act. When the pressure faded, Antonio collapsed to his knees. The Mapinguari stepped back. It waited. Antonio crawled to the supply chest and added one final page to the letters. He wrote slowly, carefully, He warned whoever found them not to search for the camp, not to avenge it, not to name what lived there. Some things, he wrote, are not monsters because monsters can be killed. This thing could only be respected. He sealed the chest again, and this time he didn't feel watched. He felt finished. Night without darkness. That evening the jungle did not go silent. It roared. Birds returned. Insects screamed. Life surged back into the clearing like breath into collapsed lungs. The smell faded for the first time in weeks. Antonio lay beside the cold fire pit, staring up through the canopy. The breathing was gone. Not distant. Gone. For the first time since arriving, Camp Verde felt like a place life could exist again, without humans. The last line he ever wrote. Antonio managed one final sentence before his strength left him. It was written calmly, clearly, not in fear, but in understanding. It has what it needed. The page ends there. No struggle marks, no bloodstains, just the impression of a man who finally understood where he stood in the world. And beyond the trees, something ancient turned its attention elsewhere. Cliffhanger ending. The letters don't say when Antonio died. Only this is certain. Camp Verde was never disturbed again. Antonio didn't die screaming. He didn't vanish either. What happened next is why Camp Verde was erased from maps and memory. The letters should have ended with Antonio's final sentence. They didn't. That's the detail historians never mention, because 3 pages followed, written in the same hand but not in the same voice. The morning after understanding, Antonio wrote that he woke after nightfall, not startled, not afraid, awake in the way a man wakes after fever breaks, weak, hollow, but clear. The camp was unchanged. The grave still stood, the fire pit cold, the tent sagging under humidity. But something fundamental was missing. The smell was gone completely. Not faded, gone. Antonio realized the jungle had accepted payment. A forest that pretends nothing happened. Life returned with unsettling speed. Birds nested in the clearing. Insects reclaimed the air. Small animals crossed the camp openly. Within hours, Camp Verde no longer felt like a place of death. It felt ignored. That frightened Antonio more than the presence ever had. Predators leave scars. Indifference erases. The mark. Antonio noticed the mark at dawn, on his chest just above the heart. No wound, no discoloration, but the skin felt wrong, colder, unresponsive, as if something beneath it no longer belonged solely to him. When Antonio pressed his palm against it, he felt pressure from the inside. A subtle answering sensation. That was the moment he understood he hadn't been spared. He had been altered. Why he was left alive. Antonio wrote that the Mapinguari didn't kill him because it didn't need to. The lesson had been learned. Now the lesson needed to travel. Someone had to carry it beyond the forest. Someone human enough to be believed, and changed enough to be warning. Antonio was no longer prey. He was evidence. The attempt to leave. He reached the river by midday. The canoe waited where it had always been, untouched, unwatched. Antonio hesitated, then stepped inside. The water carried him easily, too easily. The jungle receded without resistance. No smell, no breathing, no pursuit. Antonio wrote that he paddled for hours in silence, disturbed only by the sound of his own breath. And then he noticed something impossible. The river was looping, not curving, repeating. Landmarks passed twice, then 3 times. The jungle wasn't blocking escape. It was redirecting him, gently, patiently. The choice made clear. Antonio stopped paddling. The canoe drifted. The river stilled, not naturally, intentionally. The water became mirror smooth. Antonio saw his reflection clearly, and behind it, movement. Not the Mapinguari's full form, just the eye, visible in the water beneath his own face. Watching, waiting. Antonio understood the final truth. He was allowed to live, but not to leave. The knowledge he carried belonged to the forest now. To remove it would be theft. Antonio's decision. Antonio turned the canoe around. The river flowed again instantly, effortless, like approval. By sunset he was back at Camp Verde. The jungle welcomed him the way a place welcomes something that belongs to it. Not warmly, correctly. Antonio wrote that he felt no anger, only clarity. He had mistaken survival for victory. This was never about survival. It was about containment. What happened to the camp? Antonio spent days dismantling Camp Verde, burned what he could, sank what wouldn't burn, collapsed shelters, not under threat, not under force, under instruction he never heard spoken. He buried the supply chest deep beneath the fire pit, wrapped in oilcloth, weighted with stone. He knew someone might find it one day. That was allowed. The Mapinguari didn't fear discovery. It feared misunderstanding. The last known entry. Antonio's handwriting steadies in the final paragraph. No tremor, no rush. He writes, I'm not a prisoner. I am a boundary. He explains that the forest doesn't need guards everywhere, just reminders, places where curiosity ends. Camp Verde would become one of those places, a gap in maps, a silence in records, a rumor no one could confirm. The disappearance. That is where Antonio's writing stops. No description of death, no farewell, just absence. Search parties never found his body. No remains, no disturbed grave. The jungle took back what it needed and left nothing extra. Cliffhanger ending. Decades later, a company ledger lists Camp Verde as relocated, unviable. No explanation, no follow-up. Only one handwritten note in the margin. Do not return. Camp Verde didn't vanish in a single moment. It faded carefully, deliberately, until even memory itself became unreliable. What the world was told. Officially, Camp Verde never failed. Company records listed as relocated due to environmental inefficiency. No deaths, no incident reports, no missing persons. 10 men left Recife in 1923. None officially returned. And yet no families received death notices. Antonio's wife, Elena, waited months, then years. Letters stopped arriving, not suddenly, gradually, as if the sender had simply lost interest in the outside world. That detail troubled investigators later, those few who bothered to look at all. Because disappearance usually comes with urgency. This one came with withdrawal. The letters that shouldn't exist. The supply chest was discovered in 1948. A river trader forced ashore by storm took shelter in a half-buried clearing far upriver. He described the area as wrong but quiet. No ruins, no structures, just an unnatural flatness to the land. When he dug for firewood, his blade struck metal. The chest was sealed, wrapped, preserved. Inside were Antonio's letters. Every one of them, dry, legible, ordered. The trader said the smell hit him when he opened the lid. Not rot, metal. He resealed the chest immediately and reported it at the next port. That decision likely saved his life. Why the letters were buried. When the letters reached authorities, they were dismissed. Hallucination, isolation psychosis, a man unraveling under jungle pressure. But the archivist who cataloged them, Maria Torres, noticed something else. Antonio's handwriting didn't degrade. Not as fear increased, not as men died. It improved. Straighter lines, cleaner spacing, as if clarity had grown alongside terror. That contradicted every known case of psychological collapse. Maria flagged the letters for further study. No study ever came. The file was quietly closed. The map that lied. In the 1950s, a new survey team attempted to remap the Verde Basin. They reported something strange. Coordinates where Camp Verde should have been didn't align. Compasses pulled slightly off. River paths refused consistency. One team marked the location 3 times. Each mark placed Camp Verde somewhere different. The jungle wasn't hiding the site. It was unfixing it. The survey was abandoned. The area labeled unstable terrain. The pattern no one wanted to see. Similar gaps appeared elsewhere. Small camps, failed expeditions, abandoned clearings. Always deep, always profitable at first, always gone without evidence of violence. Local guides refused to approach those regions, not with threats, with certainty. They said the forest didn't reject outsiders. It tested them. Those who took too much were corrected. Antonio's final role. Maria Torres, the archivist, read the letters one last time before the file was sealed permanently. She noticed something she hadn't seen before. Antonio never once asked to be saved. He never begged Elena to rescue him. He never suggested escape after his understanding was complete. Instead, his final writings read like instructions, like someone ensuring a mechanism was set properly before stepping away. Maria wrote one sentence in the margin before closing the file. This man didn't survive. He was repurposed. She resigned 2 months later. Wouldn't say why no one goes back. In the decades since, explorers have tried. Satellite imagery shows nothing unusual. No ruins, no anomalies, but ground teams report the same thing. Equipment fails, GPS drifts, radios lose clarity, and always, just before turning back, a smell, metallic, heavy, not carried by wind, moving. Every team leaves. None press further. Those who try don't return, not dramatically, quietly, as if they simply chose another life somewhere else. The forest remembers. Antonio wrote that the Mapinguari did not hate humans, but it remembered them, learned them, cataloged their behaviors, and once learned, it no longer needed to repeat lessons the same way. Camp Verde was a classroom. Antonio was the final lecture, the last unanswered question. If Antonio became a boundary, then what happens when boundaries age? What happens when memory fades? What happens when the world grows hungry again? Because forests are shrinking. Rivers are mapped. Deep places are fewer. And guardians don't disappear when ignored. They wait. Patient. Breathing! Cliffhanger ending. The final note in the archive file reads, "If the letters are ever reread in full, it means the forest is preparing to teach again." The forest didn't end the story. It sealed it until the day someone broke the seal, the year the letters were opened again. In 2019, a digitization project reopened Maria Torres's sealed archive. Not intentionally. A junior technician, outsourced, underpaid, flagged Antonio's letters as historical value high. The system auto-approved the scan. No human reviewer noticed the warning note in the margin. By the time anyone did, it was too late. What changed after the upload? Within weeks, anomalies began. Researchers accessing the files reported headaches, metallic taste, a persistent smell near their screens. One claimed the scent lingered after logging out. Another said their dreams shifted. Dense trees, breathing dark, a presence watching without hostility. Always patient. IT dismissed it as stress, until the server room began to malfunction. Hard drives failed, only those storing the Camp Verde scans. Not erased, rewritten. Logs showed file access at hours no one was logged in. The system wasn't breached. It was responding. Antonio's missing pages. During the chaos, a researcher noticed something terrifying. The scanned letters contained pages that did not exist in the physical archive. Not added after. They were always there, undetectable until read digitally. The handwriting was Antonio's. The tone was calm. The content was instructional. Antonio described how understanding spreads faster through curiosity than fear. How knowledge once seen wants to be shared. How boundaries fail when warnings become stories. The modern lesson. The new pages ended with a line that chilled everyone who read it. "You no longer need to come here. We are coming to you." After that, the pages went blank. Not deleted. Blank. As if the message had been delivered. The technician who walked away. The junior technician resigned without notice. Left his phone. Left his apartment. Left his shoes by the door. Cameras showed him leaving calmly at dawn, heading toward the tree line outside the city. He was never reported missing. No family filed a claim. No records followed. It was as if the system had learned something new about distance. Why this story exists. Camp Verde is still unmarked. The forest still breathes. And Antonio's role remains intact. Not a monster. Not a victim. A mechanism. A reminder that some places do not defend themselves with walls or violence. But with understanding. Once you truly understand, you stop pushing. The final truth. The Mapinguari never needed to chase humans. Humans always come willingly, drawn by mystery, by profit, by curiosity. And now, by stories. Final line, cold ending. If you're hearing this, it means the boundary held, this time.